Welcome everyone, and we'll start with the news. Martian auroras have been detected by NASA's MAVEN back in 2019, and now they've been confirmed by the UAE's HOPE Martian orbiter. In science, you always have to say, hey, look what I've discovered or observed, and then you have to have somebody else independent come in and go, you're right, that's what you saw. So now that they've confirmed it, Mars apparently has auroras that you can see during the nighttime part of when Mars is in night, and they're not visible. They're in UVB, mid-range ultraviolet. So I'll actually be doing a presentation on the Martian auroras in a few weeks. I've already started writing it. I sent in the email the two links for 2019 MAVEN discovery and the 2021 UAE HOPE discovery. So on Sunday, July 10th at 9 a.m., that's tomorrow morning, wake up early, Virgin Galactic will launch Sir Richard Branson and 5 others, some are paying, from a spacecraft that's carried underneath a high altitude aircraft to suborbital status. They're not going into orbit, using a rocket that they launched from the aircraft, and then they'll land it as an airplane. On Tuesday, July 20th, Blue Origin will launch Jeff Bezos, his brother, and Mercury 13 astronaut candidate Wally Funk, and a couple of paying customers on the New Shepard suborbital launch. It has a capsule on top of the rocket. The capsule will come down by parachute, and the rocket will land pretty much where it left from. Hubble is still in safe mode at this point. I checked this afternoon, it's still in safe mode. They're attempting to restart it by switching around some of the connections and using some backup components. This is kind of the only thing they have left to do because there is no servicing capability for Hubble. So just in time for all these heat waves that are rolling through the Western US, somebody's come up with a mirror fabric. This is a fabric that cools better than mercerized cotton. It will drop your skin temperature by almost 9 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees C. I would say if that's the best they can do, they need to come up with even higher tech fabrics that use your body heat to produce a tiny amount of electricity that they then run through a Peltier layer to produce cooling, so that you can use your own body heat to drive its cooling. It's not an enormous effect, probably about the same range as their 9 degrees Fahrenheit difference, but I think it would be interesting for them to make fabric like that.
They don't now?
As far as I know, they do not. They don't make electronic fabric like that.
But you have this idea.
Yes.
Very good.
I've worked with both the Seebeck and the Peltier effects. Seebeck is when you take heat and produce electricity, and Peltier is when you take electricity and you reduce the temperature of one side of a substance at the expense of the other, so it transfers heat away. The Ingenuity helicopter on Mars has had its successful 9th flight. They're starting to get a little dangerous with it, is the best way to describe it. Remember, it flies by itself. It's autonomous. So they just give it kind of a few pointers mission, and it goes and flies it, and then it sits down and goes, done. And, people capture, the rover will capture pictures of it, and it will take pictures of the landscape around it and the ground beneath it. It flew for 2 minutes and 46 seconds. Its fastest speed was 5 meters per second, and it was at a height of a whopping 154 feet or 47 meters. I guess this is the highest, fastest, and farthest it's flown to date. They weren't so much concerned about the high, fast, and farthest as they were about the terrain that it was flying over was rocky. It was rough. If they had to set down, it would probably set down just fine. Their concern was whether the onboard autonomous flight cameras would misjudge the rocky terrain thinking it was flat and land on top of some jagged rocks. But it worked fine. So they can look forward to using that pattern matching in the future, I guess. SpaceX's uncrewed Dragon capsule, their cargo capsule, splashed down in the Gulf of Mexico this week. It was carrying 2.4 thousand grams or 5,300 pounds of research specimens, experiments, and other equipment that's going to be analyzed now that it's back on Earth. I think this is the largest amount of cargo they've ever brought back. It splashed down in the Gulf of Mexico by parachute, and it was picked up on the SpaceX. They have 2 ships that do that kind of thing, and then brought back to the Cape. It has to go around the Gulf of Mexico, though. They didn't splash it down in the Atlantic. They splashed it down in the Gulf, and now they have to go back around the Cape. Or maybe they'll fly it. Then maybe they'll just take the stuff out of it, fly that via helicopter, and then they'll get the capsule back whenever. It's SpaceX's problem. So not to be left out, China's space agency has released some more pictures from their rover on Mars. Their rover is solar powered, and it looks like they're starting to gather dust on their solar panels. So maybe their rover can, find a little hill and tilt it up a little bit, and maybe the dust will slide off. But that's always been the demise of solar powered rovers on Mars, is when their solar cells get too dusty to generate enough electricity to keep them warm at night, they end. So hopefully that won't be the end of their rover.
The whole deal is that they need to use, maybe 4,000 years old technology.
What's that? A
Look at
fan?
the picture.
They need an arm with a fan on it?
No, it's a broom.
Oh, a broom. That might
Yeah.
scratch the solar cells.
This
Well, they
broom-
invented pasta
What?
and paper and gunpowder and brooms.
Yeah. This is a 10,000 years old technology, brooms.
Or a windshield wiper.
That's too much mechanical stuff. I think maybe all they really need to do is just put the solar panels on a tilt platform. So when they gather dust, they sort of take the entire solar array and go and shake it and then bring it back down. That would probably be the easiest.
Oddly, they say the half of the cause of the demise of that building in what the heck's that town north of Miami Beach, that they had it drain on the pool deck was a flat surface, and the waterproofing didn't work, and so being on a flat surface and not tilted, the chlorinated water would just go into the cracks and dry, and more would go in the cracks, and it wouldn't run off just because it wasn't tilted.
That's certainly something that's plausible. I also think the fact that they did no maintenance on it when they saw they had a problem more than 10 years ago would say, you can only hold off the inevitable so long.
10
Also-
years? 10
also-
years?
Yeah, also they were right on the beach, and the beach is notorious for having salty humidity and water, and during hurricanes, the water level, I'm sure, came up and filled the garage, and salt water and the ironing concrete don't go well together. That's why seawall concrete is different than building concrete.
Really? What's the difference?
Well, one has to be exposed to salt water and the other one doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
Yeah.
both concrete, but the chemistry is a little different.
Yeah, what's the difference with the concrete?
Well, you need to be
Yeah,
able
Monroe,
to,
what's the chemical difference? Come on, how does it resist the chloride ion? Come on.
it's calcium carbonate in the presence of chlorine. How do you do that in a swimming pool? You add a layer of polyethylene or polyurethane to it. That's the Marsite stuff that's on the inside of your pool. Now for buildings, I guess you just try and keep the water out, and if you notice cracks, you seal them. But for seawalls that are exposed to ocean water, they typically will pour them, and the forms will actually be sitting in water, and they'll harden in water. So
Yeah,
the Romans actually came up with concrete that would set underwater. I don't know the particular formula for it, but I know it was the Romans that came up with it because they had to build harbors.
Wow.
You never know how much you don't know until you know what you don't know.
Exactly.
Okay, NASA has contracted Northrop Grumman to build the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, also known as HALO, which is the crew quarters for the Lunar Gateway Lunar Orbiting Space Station. So if we ever build the space station and send it up around in orbit around the moon, that the crew quarters will have been built by Northrop Grumman. Of course, how Northrop Grumman will get it to lunar orbit, that's still the big question. If it's the United Launch Alliance, they'll get back to us when they get that big rocket working. And in the case of SpaceX, if they get the contract, they already have one of those big rockets. That's the Falcon Heavy. So a team led by a Chinese nanoscientist has fabricated bendable ice. Apparently, if you line up the water molecules just so at extremely low temperatures and pressures, that the ice crystals line up and you can flex them. So in the email that I sent around, there's actually a link there that has a little video. Now, granted, it's very microscopic. It's not nanoscale imaging that they're showing you. It's just microscopic, but the actual crystals are nanoscale. So it's once again how nanofabrication or metamaterials behave differently than their large scale or room temperature cousins. So here's another aspect of science that I think we're just starting to get involved in as a species. They took photographic observations of Jupiter's aurora, and they correlated that, the time of them, with the European Space Agency's Newton Earth orbiting X-ray observations, because they've always kind of been concerned that the X-ray bursts that occur on Jupiter may be what's stimulating the aurora. And they found a time correlation that the X-ray bursts occur before large aurora displays on Jupiter. So it could be that, you know, there's something happening deep down in the atmosphere or into the core of Jupiter that is causing the X-ray bursts, and it's the X-ray bursts that are traveling along the magnetic field lines that are causing the aurora.
Some of the explanation was understood is that because Io pulls out a lot of stuff that can be ionized by the solar radiation, and also gets captured by the lines of magnetic field of Jupiter, that thousands and thousands stronger than Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And then those ions get ripped, the electrons out, so they become charged particles, and they get accelerated by the Jupiter's magnetosphere. And then as they go, they impact in the poles and have those X-rays. So it's a relation to the very strong magnetic fields, most likely caused by the metallic hydrogen inside Jupiter, and solar radiation and emissions of particles of Io. So it's a mix of all of them.
As the saying goes, it's never just one thing.
No.
Space is related stuff. Everything's connected. So on Tuesday, July 13th, right at sunset until maybe an hour afterwards, Venus and Mars will be less than 1 degree apart in the sky. They're calling it a conjunction, but I'd say it's just barely less than 1 degree apart, which for visual observing without any magnification whatsoever, it'll look like they're really close together. But the moment that you put even a small telescope on it, they're going to be separated.
So if you stretch your arm and put your indicator up like this, you can make the planet separated by a finger. So that would be 1 degree.
Yeah. So like I said, it's not going to be an occultation because remember, Mars is on one side and Venus is on the other side. Russia is once again threatening to leave the International Space Station. But from an examination, it doesn't seem to make financial or space program sense for them to do it. I think it's just a simple form of political protest. They've got to find, some way to say, and we don't like you either. But they apparently don't have the budget money to go it alone and launch their own space station. Now that the US is no longer getting rides on Soyuz, they're not taking in as much money from us. Apparently, NASA actually booked a few empty seats that we're not going to be using. So we paid Russia for astronaut flights to the International Space Station that we realized we're not going to be using. But we just went, yeah, Russia, you can keep. And my favorite one of all this week was scientists have finally gotten the fact that not everything in the universe is aligned such that they can be seen from Earth. So if you think about things like quasars and pulsars, these are things that beam out very high levels of energy. And if their equatorial plane is not lined up to the plane of our solar system, then we can't see that energy because it's not pointed in our direction. So any pulsar that is not sending energy our way would essentially be invisible to us. Any quasar, which is kind of like a black hole in the center of a galaxy, any quasar that doesn't have its poles pointed towards us, we wouldn't get that energy, so it would be very hard to detect it unless we just went, well, it's in the center of that galaxy over there, so that must be where the black hole is. But we can't see it or measure it because it's a black hole. So I just find it fascinating that we know that there's not sufficient mass in the universe, and therefore we need dark matter, but we have things in the universe that are very high mass that we just go, well, we can't detect those. So, I think dark is the correct question. Dark matter, does that include matter you can't see, but is there that you could see if it was pointed in the right direction?
Well, we can have a good idea of the mass of things that we see around us just because of the gravitational effects. I don't need to see a quasar if there is a cluster of galaxies or something that are being, lensed, or the being interactions with, when you see the Doppler shift moving fast or moving slower towards us, you can actually see the calculation and you can see those orbits and the mass of those clusters of galaxies. So because you're missing one tiny little piece doesn't mean that that is a lot of mass still being seen. Most of the stuff you can actually measure, the mass of the universe by the gravitational effects.
I've got two counters to that. One is the universe is 360 degrees by 360 degrees. So if there are things you cannot detect because they're pulsars and they're not part of a galaxy or a larger structure, they are heavy gravitational fields that you cannot detect.
Yes, you can. If you can see something of that galaxy,
you can't.
you can.
No, you can't.
When it gets that far from quasars, you're not seeing the interaction.
I didn't say quasar, I said pulsar.
Oh, pulsars is inside of the galaxy. So it's like it's not that bad because you can actually see other stars nearby and you can calculate the whole mass of that galaxy for what you can see. Now, in the case of quasars, because they are very, very far away, and in a young universe, what you actually see is in the interactions of clusters of galaxies.
Good for quasars. Pulsars are still not there yet.
But if you don't see a pulsar that is between you and the center of the galaxy, you see anything that's behind you and you can see the speed of the orbit. You can calculate the whole mass of that galaxy. Whenever you see anything orbiting anything, you can calculate the mass. Doesn't matter what I see in there or not. Whatever is not visible, it could be anything, but I can calculate what is massive and the whole mass of the galaxy.
How do we know there are pulsars? I forgot.
Huh?
I forgot how we.
Pulsars are neutron stars. They're emitting intense, typically mid to high level radio energy out their poles. So if it's not tilted over where it can send that pulse to us, a pulsar is not visually observed. So you're not going to see it. If it's only observable in radio and you can't detect the radio because the pole's not tilted towards you, it might as well be a black hole. But since it's an individual star, there won't be other stars orbiting it.
Yeah, the hard part is whenever they're not in like spurs or clusters, those are very hard for you to detect. But whenever they are in clusters, even if you don't see them directly, you can see the interaction.
And if they're not in clusters, how many are there? If they're not in clusters, how many are there?
Well, doesn't matter how many. Well, it matters for some people who do research, but when you want to calculate the whole mass of the galaxy, you don't need to see everything. You need whatever is visible to you. You can see how far is from the center and what is the speed of the rotational velocity. And then you can calculate the mass, the central mass. It's Kepler Newton calculation. So answering Joanne's question is that when you have stars, they're very low mass, like our own sun, they end in white dwarf when they finish their lives. When you have more massive stars, they go kaboom, they go supernova, and they have two ends, or they become a neutron star, or they become a black hole. A neutron star is like the atoms are destroyed, the electrons go inside the nucleus of the atom, and then you create a full matter, a weird kind of matter that is made of neutrons. So that's why you call a neutron star. So it's dead stars, white dwarfs, neutron stars that form the pulsars that you can see the pulse in radio. And then you can have the black holes. They're also kind of sometimes visible in radio when they are feeding.
But you can't see them in radio if they're not tilted towards you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they're saying is, if you can't detect them, how do you know how many there are?
Is there an answer?
No.
No, it's called science only thinks it understands everything.
We're getting there slowly.
Slowly, yes. Because there are a lot of people that want to stay with the science that they grew up on as opposed to the science that they're learning.
Yeah, but you know, it's like 100 years ago, it was in a notebook of Einstein's, and today we have like a huge instrument that can see gravitational waves. That's like, whoa, it's a change.
Right, and maybe gravitational waves are just one of a first of series of measurements that we previously could not make.
Mm-hmm.
But we're still measuring it all based upon counting electrons, which I'll get into next week. So I posted the quantum computers presentation out on the YouTube site. Here's an update on something I mentioned last week. On July 22nd, Jill Tarter of SETI fame will be presenting A Cosmic Perspective, Searching for Aliens, Finding Ourselves. It's a free presentation by the Astronomical Society of the Pacific. I included a link in the email that I sent around. So that I think will be interesting. So this week I received an email from the park ranger that manages Fern Forest Nature Center. They're going to be resuming astronomical public outreach observing in September. I was sent the email directly as well as the BOD of the other organization. And I had to ask her, since I've been the person primarily planning and leading the observing sessions for more than 13 years at Fern Forest, let me tell you about the new group and we'll see what they do with it. So to that end, I've contacted the head of Broward County's STEAM, Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math program to see what the required approvals would be or any special use permits or background checks that I would need to resume doing this kind of thing. Let's see how many hoops we have to jump through. The number of times that I did private observing sessions, as in I was the only one there with a telescope and I was doing it at a library or I was doing it at a park. It wasn't every time, but it was often enough that I just got used to it and did them. So we'll see how well that goes. And also as a reminder, I don't know when it's actually going to come out, but in July, I'm scheduled to do an interview with the Broward County Library Creation Stations manager. When they're going to put it in or whether it's just going to be me or a panel or something, I'll find out next week. And I've gotten more detail from the James Webb Space Telescope Institute. Goddard Space Flight Center is actually managing the publicity for the launch of the JWST. And the person I'm working with there is Peter Sooy, S-O-O-Y. He's at Goddard. And apparently they want us to put together an event either before the launch or shortly thereafter. It used to be before the launch and they've added shortly thereafter. I guess too many people got burned by we'll do it shortly before the launch, and then the launch got canceled. So now they've given them the opportunity to, or you can do it shortly after the launch. So
What sort of event?
Educational session, showing people where they can go online to watch the launch. If the launch has already occurred, how to play back the event. We're going to get into the details of it on August 20th. The actual launch is currently scheduled for October 31st. Happy Halloween. So,
Oh dear. I hope it's good omens.
then there's reality.
Yes. So the idea would be something like explain what is the telescope, where it's going to be. Kids love to see the antennas that communicate with the telescope. So it's good to show the web page that has the antennas for communication.
It'll definitely be the Deep Space Network because JWST is not Earth orbiting. It's Earth orbit around the sun trailing. It's at L2 point.
Yeah, so it's good to see which antenna relays.
Yep.
If there is another satellite that relays, if it's good to have like models of the telescope. If they have anything in their page for 3D for people to download, it's kind of fun. The other thing is that we could do is explain what is infrared, just like you do for Sophia.
Yep.
Talk about how the sky looks like in visible light, how the sky looks like in infrared, explain the whole spectrum of light, and point out that humans are blind compared to like mantis shrimp or something. So you can find ways to, one, explain what is the telescope, explain what is the wavelength, and kids love to see the antennas that communicate too.
Yeah, I'll get into more of that as I get closer to the August 20th date, when I have to interact with them as to what the content of the event's going to be. Also, they suggested comparing and contrasting Hubble to JWST.
That's a good one.
They can both see in infrared, but Hubble can actually see in things other than infrared, whereas the JWST apparently can only see in infrared.
Yeah, but there's more wavelengths in infrared for the James Webb.
It can see in a broader range of infrared. And
like if you compare the whole spectrum, there is more that James Webb can see like the full spectrum of in numbers. There's more in infrared to be seen than what the whole wavelength that Hubble Space Telescope can see, because it's near infrared and near ultraviolet, invisible.
I didn't think it was ultraviolet. I'll have to go back and look.
No, Hubble Space Telescope can see ultraviolet.
Yes, Hubble can.
No, I'm not talking about, even though the Hubble can see visible.
Yeah.
The visible part of the spectrum is very small compared to how much you have in infrared
Yes.
in numbers.
Yes.
And then the wavelength the Hubble is had near infrared and near ultraviolet. So if you add all those wavelengths, the Hubble Space Telescope is very limited, especially to look through clouds and through dust. And the James Webb Telescope is going to be able to see dust clouds inside the galaxies. Is going to be able to see very cold bodies in the solar system, like those could have our name on it.
Yeah.
And or address. So it's going to be an awesome telescope if we finally launches.
I did find out something curious this week about Hubble and all of its repair stuff. The computer processor on board Hubble is an Intel 486. One per, one for the primary and one for the secondary for each of the 4 computers. The other thing is, I think originally it had 16K bytes of core memory, and the last servicing mission they replaced it with solid state memory, but I think it's 2 gigabytes of solid state memory. So your average thumb drive nowadays has more storage than Hubble. The Hubble optical the basic design of the spacecraft dates back to the 1980s. The couple of servicing missions that they did replaced some parts with not the latest technology that they had at the time, but the latest stable and reliable technology that NASA was using. So even though they might have replaced something, in the late 90s, it was replaced with components from the early 90s. So just think about how much computer technology's improved since the early 90s.
That I can think of, but I think the Hubble has done amazing for the amount of.
Oh,
ability
absolutely.
it has.
I don't want to lose it anytime soon.
Yeah. Even with the
I
limited
was looking-
abilities.
Oh, that is one cool thing that England, that it's a proof of concept, still is not even projected yet, but that is agency. I forgot the name of this agency. They pick up the booster that fell in Australia. So the first satellite that the British is launching into space, and now they have a project that is a proof of concept to actually get in space and grab the satellite and put it in a museum, because it was the first one. So the idea is that if that works, it will be good, because you can or kick out stuff that's far away from Earth, so to clean up a little bit the orbit of the satellites, or actually push down to the orbit.
Yeah, as long as it's low Earth orbiting or medium Earth orbiting, you probably can go up and pull it back down, or add a booster to it to keep it up there longer. When things get to be in geostationary orbit, it's rare to send the entire rocket up to geo orbit, because it just costs too much energy. So what you do is you have a first stage that gets it up to low Earth, then you have a second stage that takes it up to middle, and the second stage is jettisoned, and then the spacecraft itself has its own onboard thruster that after a while gets it all the way up to geostationary, because geostationary is 23,000 miles out. And once you get up there, it takes a lot of energy to loft something up there just to bring you back.
Yeah, no, this satellite, because it was launched in the 60s, it's not too far away. It has a very elliptical orbit, and the closest orbit is feasible to reach.
Yes, yes. Ammonia
Molinia.
Uh-huh.
It says one of my favorite kinds of orbit.
Yeah.
Monilia. Monilia.
Molnia.
Monia. Oh, Monia.
No, not Linia.
No, Linia. Molnia. Molnia.
Molnia.
Yeah, Molnia.
Russian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Molnia.
Yeah.
So
What
what else did I read? I post some stuff on my Facebook page.
Yeah.
I think that's the only one that you mentioned that I didn't. That was the idea of the orbit. They brought a booster that fell on. It was an outbreak in Australia for for this last 40 years,
Mhm.
and then they actually travel and put in a museum. And now the plan is to capture the first satellite.
So in 2017, there was an ad hoc discussion that Elon Musk was having about what his new Starship could do. And he said, well, it can act kind of like a Pac-Man. It can open the fairing half and then scoop up satellites and then bring them back. And only now are people going, really? How would you do that? Well, it's big enough. It could probably fit Hubble if you snap off the solar panels. But once you get it in there, there's no astronaut that's going to strap it down. So when you want to bring it back, it's going to rattle around inside the spacecraft, and that's not good for either.
No, the Hubble Space Telescope has something on the back that was installed the last trip, that it has like something to be grabbed.
But that presumes you have an arm to grab it.
Yeah, so they might do
Starship
something.
has no arm. The X-37B does. That little thing the CIA owned.
Monroe, did you see the question?
The question.
Sally asked the question.
Yes, and it wasn't just old satellites to intercept asteroids. It was retasking existing geosynchronous satellites to intercept asteroids and building new satellites that have geosynchronous capability to intercept asteroids. The problem is the same problem we've had all along. If you find them more than 4 or 5 years before they're going to approach the Earth, you can probably do something about it.
Yeah.
But you have to look at the number of asteroids that are sizable that have actually come in from the direction of the sun that we didn't actually see until they already went by the Earth.
After
Wow.
they already shaved.
Yes, and there was one of them that was 500 feet across that actually passed below geosynchronous orbit. But luckily it was going fast enough. It was coming in out of the sun. We didn't see it. We just happened to go, oh, look, what's that? Where did that come from?
Oh, by the way, you made me remember. I have another one. Remember the space rock that they were not sure that fell off in a farm in England?
Yes.
They just finished to classify that one, so it's actually carbonation chondrite and received the official name. And the scientists who were doing the studies, they are actually working at the same time on Hayabusa sample, and also in this one that fell off like alive, that's like in a piece, because it's very rare for carbonation chondrites to survive the atmosphere. So it was very lucky that happened. And they work both of them, and they study the sample. They look at the isotopic composition and the chemical composition, and they figure out that it's really a space rock, it's a carbonaceous chondrite, and it's the same kind of what the Hayabusa sample. And most likely the other one that I forgot the name. Do you remember the name?
You sent it to me this afternoon. I didn't get to include
Nope.
that in the news.
The one that we watch on TV. It was recent. It was last year.
No, I've forgotten it. So many things since then.
Okay, I will remember later.
Thank you.
eventually.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's yet another, maybe we can retask something or retask an industry to create something that will help us out, because the people that should be helping us out aren't coming up with answers other than we're going to send some nukes up and blow it up.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that's probably the last thing you want to do.
The red dwarf. Send a red dwarf.
No, not red dwarf. What you want to send is red matter.
No, yeah, but wasn't the red dwarf a TV comedy series about
Yes, it
some
was.
space men?
Yeah, yes, it was. But if you remember the latest incarnation of Star Trek movies, Spock was taking red matter to eliminate a problem with a sun going nova, because apparently red
Yeah.
matter will create a black hole at the center of things and suck stuff into a black hole. So we just need to
Yep.
create a black hole inside the asteroid, but not too big a one. So it just keeps going by.
Okay.
Yeah, and
that
at
would
one
work.
point in the not too distant past, we couldn't detect gravity waves either. So,
Exactly. It was
and we had lovely math that would prove that, you know, you're never going to get your aircraft to go faster than the speed of sound. It'll just explode. But, you know,
Uh-huh.
we conquer these things eventually. We just have to stop laughing first and start going, Okay, this evening's presentation is on commercial US spaceports. This is something that I've been keeping a watchful eye on, like, what are they, where are they popping up? And is anybody watching out for this? So that's what we're going to be doing tonight, is that.
Oh,
So what's a spaceport? It does lots of things, and it's probably not what you think of the stereotypical. It launches rockets. It's a lot more than that. It's a classification that allows industry to get involved in space technology. So you can have an aeronautical spaceport, which is like saying, okay, we have runways. Okay, but the runways are going to be used for aircraft that will carry instruments that will be, you know, launched from the belly of airplanes into suborbit. So they're doing things with space, or you can do like Richard Branson and launch tourism to suborbital flights. So
yeah.
aeronautical spaceports. This one was a little unusual. Balloons of all classes. So if you're launching meteorological or weather balloons, that's kind of considered a spaceport by the FAA's definition, because you're sending something up into space.
So that would be true.
And also there are helium-filled balloon launches where they're launching tons of space-carrying instruments, like large telescopes that they loft into high altitudes. They hang around in circular patterns around the southern pole, and then they bring them back down by parachute. And these balloon launches can be low altitude, like meteorological, or they can go right to the edge of space just before the balloon explodes. So they have a very wide range of altitudes. And then there's the stereotypical rocket spaceport. You can have a rocket that's launched but never goes into orbit. It doesn't get up high enough. So it just goes up and then down, kind of like the Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic craft. You can have low Earth orbiting, kind of like OneWeb and SpaceX, where they launch satellites. The orbit may have a duration of only a few days in the case of some of the spy satellites, or the orbits may last 5 years or so until they degrade and come back. You can also have high orbital launches that the orbit might last for years to decades. You can have the geosynchronous ones that they'll last based upon their reliability and their fuel. And when they start to get to their end of life, they don't come back. They just put them in a parking orbit and keep them up there because it takes too much to get them back. Then you have the unusual launches. If you want to launch something into what is known as a solar polar orbit, because you want the Earth to rotate underneath your orbit and you're doing a polar orbit, then you launch that from very high altitudes or very low altitudes to give yourself the momentum to do that. And then you have the inclined orbits that you could launch from anywhere, the highly elliptical, the Molnia. You can be launching things for interplanetary. You can do heavy launches. You can do crewed launches, as in people on board. You can do planetary exploration missions, which these days are launching bigger and bigger things. Or you can have the grand tours, the Voyager types, where you might launch something and it might take decades for it to actually reach its target. And then it takes more decades to depart the solar system, kind of like New Horizons that we sent to Pluto, and it took 10 years to get there. And now it's off exploring the Kuiper Belt. I found out that you can have a spaceport where you didn't actually launch anything from there. It's a spaceport devoted to receiving things. So things come back from space at your spaceport. So much like the Virgin Galactic spacecraft, it's coming back landing on a runway. So if you have the right length runway, that could be your spaceport. Or you can have rockets that land a la the SpaceX Falcon 9s that land on land. Or here's another side effect, which is they can land at sea on a platform or parachute and then be brought back by ship to your spaceport for servicing. So you can have a spaceport that has an adjacent seaport, and that's still called a spaceport. So in order to let more industry in, the definition of spaceport is flexible. So what do you do at a spaceport? Well, it could be manufacturing. You could be building spacecraft. You could be building the rockets that launch the spacecraft. You could be a company that produces subcomponents like rocket stages, engines, control systems, or even space suits. There's one spaceport that their first tenant customer was a spacesuit manufacturer, and they called that a spaceport. Okay. Or you can refurbish things. You may not launch them, you may not land them, you may just bring them back to rework them to be launched again, and somehow they call that a spaceport. Obviously, if you do liftoffs or launches, those are launch sites, those are spaceports. And if you do landings, but also recoveries and refurbishments, those are also considered spaceports. Time for some pictures. So in the top left, we have a helium-filled balloon that is launching an enormous space telescope. And you can see the picture of the man there. Let me see if I can get this. Pointer options, give me the laser pointer. There's a man right there. You can see how big the balloon is and how big the satellite is. It's actually just something that hangs below the balloon until the balloon ends its mission, and then the satellite, the instrument, comes back by a parachute. You can have meteorological balloons. These are quite familiar. These are where they go up, they take weather samples, and then the balloon is popped by a little thing that pierces the balloon. And then there's a little tiny parachute here that the instrument package comes back, and it has a beacon on it so you can find out where it is so they can reuse it. There's a place called Wallops Island, Virginia, where they do a lot of upper altitude launches for both the military and for scientific purposes. This is a Black Bart rocket, and it launches from a rail, and it's not a vertical rail. The rail is actually tilted, and it launches out the rail. Then, of course, here you have Virgin Galactic. This is Branson's. And you can see here's this, the spacecraft, and then you have the Arrow spacecraft that actually flies it up to around 50,000 feet before it takes off. Here's one of Blue Origin's New Shepard rockets taking off. It has a platform for maintaining the rocket before launch, but it kind of is launched from a little stubby thing sitting on the ground that it launches from. It's not all that tall. Here is the SpaceX bigger rocket. And you can see it only has a couple of engines running here. So this is just the prototype testing. Nobody on board. This one actually does a belly flop landing, not landing, but a belly flop descent to slow itself down without needing parachutes. And then you have the bigger SpaceX. Here's a Falcon 9 taking off. And you can see it has this erector tower. The kind of, as it lifts off, it gets out of the way. It kind of tilts back and gets out of the way so it can launch. And then you have the bigger SpaceX, the Falcon Heavy, and it has, you can see it's got a very much heavier payload, and it's got two strap-ons. So this is actually 3 Falcon 9s side by side, and its tower for servicing is fixed, but the tower that's attached to the rocket at launch time is also one of these fallback towers, just like it is for the Falcon 9. So this is the breadth of what liftoffs or launches look like at things called spaceports. Now, what goes up has to come back down eventually. So here's the breadth of definitions of a spaceport for things coming back or being refurbished. This is a Falcon Dragon crew capsule. They were originally going to land them using the Draco rockets, and you can see the little stubby landing legs. And they decided, after what happened with the Starship and it not landing right, it's probably not good to bring people back that way. So they decided to can that, and they actually bring the Crew Dragon capsules back by landing them with multiple parachutes in the ocean. So if one parachute has a hole in it or whatever, they've still got enough parachute left over. And they bring them up on a ship, and then the ship docks at the Spaceports Seaport. This is what Blue Origin does. Here's a New Shepard landing back on the ground. You can see it has little stubby landing legs, and it has one engine. It lands back on the ground. And then within visual range of the actual landing of the booster, you have the landing of the capsule, and the capsule has 3 parachutes, and it actually lands in the desert. And just before it lands, it actually blows out compressed gas to create a cushion of air to make it land even softer, because remember, they have paying customers on board. Think of it this way. If you've ever seen swim meets where you have high diving and you see where they blow air bubbles into the water to make it where you land on the, you go into the water and the water is not hard like concrete. That's the same thing they're doing here. They're blowing dust up so that the capsule lands on a cushion rather than landing on the solid ground. This is how a Falcon 9 booster normally gets back to the Earth. It lands on a ship offshore, and then they bring it's a barge. No, there's nobody on board in case something goes wrong. They bring it back to shore where they can service it. So here you have the barge docked at the seaport next to the spaceport. And this was the sci-fi moment when they did a launch of Falcon Heavy, and they brought back the 2 side boosters and landed them pretty much simultaneously within a second of each other on the ground. That was just a sci-fi moment that became reality. So that's landing things. So we're only going to focus on the US commercial spaceports. There's a lot of other launch and landing sites that are either exclusive for government use or you can lease them for commercial use. So people are probably familiar with Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center. There is one that's very highly used at Wallops Island, Virginia. People have heard of Edwards and Vandenberg in California. Back in the days of the V2, when they bring the brought the V2s back to the US. They launched them from Los Alamos. There is still a Department of Defense launch center in Los Alamos. How many people knew that there was a launch complex in Hawaii? Because it's further north. And even further north, there is a launch complex at Kodiak, Alaska, that is commercial, NASA, and military. And I'm not going to be talking about the US aerospace companies that are probably well known, but don't have a launch or landing site. They have no actual spaceport. They just build stuff and ship it elsewhere. People might have heard of Bigelow Aerospace. Due to the pandemic in 2020, they actually laid off all their staff. So if they get resurrected, you might be hearing from them, but at the moment, they're kind of shut down, mothballed. And if people are going, but are there any spaceports outside the US? Here's a laundry list of them. Hey, Helen, Brazil has a spaceport, and
I know.
it's at 3 degrees south latitude. So it's at a good location.
Yes. They call it the barrier of the devil. It's Alcantara.
China has
The
multiple.
barrier of hell. Barrier of hell. Hell. Yeah. It's over there. It's near where I serve in the army. It's arid and it's so hot. It's like it's hotter than Florida, and some areas are even humid than Florida, but there are areas that are dry. So that Alcantara is very dry.
Yep. But it's not a desert. I took a look at it today on Google Earth, and there's a lot of jungle around it. But you're right. Its latitude and humidity are off the charts. So it would be very uncomfortable to be there to launch something.
Yeah, so they call it hell there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. India has 4 launch sites. One of them is so high altitude that you've got to wonder, do people have to wear oxygen to be at that launch site? Indonesia has their own. Iran has 3. Israel has 1. Italy has 1. Japan has 3. In Kazakhstan, there is one that is leased to Russia. That's the Baikonur Cosmodrome. There's another one that's also leased to Russia. And then Russia has its own. They also have their own 3 launch sites within Russia that they don't have to lease from Kazakhstan. French Guiana on the north coast of South America, also a nice temperate zone. The European Space Agency launches from there because Europe is too far north latitude for a good push. And we'll get to why latitude makes a difference. In New Zealand, there's Rocket Lab. North Korea has 2 sites. Norway, because there's such high latitude, they have 2 launch sites. Pakistan has 2 launch sites. Theirs are more like converted military rocket launch sites. And South Korea has 2. So just describe us as a well-established spacefaring species. We launch lots of stuff.
We don't pay attention to all these other places.
No, we only, as the saying goes, we only look where the light's good. So
Okay.
if there are launches occurring in North Korea, we might have a news article on it, but we certainly have no governance over it. And if they're launching things from,
Well, North Korea's I could expect, but some of these places like Norway, you
Yes.
know, why wouldn't we hear about them?
because
don't
they're
have
doing
space
things,
here.
they're doing things for their own nation. You know, they're doing their own space research and their own commercial satellite launches. So has nothing to do with us. So we dumb Americans don't hear about it. But
Well,
if you
are
go
we
out
not
there and look,
interested?
you can see there are a lot more launch sites than this, but historically they've shut down because they weren't the best design or they weren't in the right place. So they, have picked better and better ones and built newer ones.
Thank you.
So in the US, who's the government agency that says, yep, that's a spaceport and it's okay to launch things from there? The US Department of Transportation's Federal Aviation Administration. The US Secretary of Transportation is the final sign off on your spaceport. And it is by way of US Code 2018. That means in 2018 is when they came up with this. Title 51, which is the FAA, and Section 51501 actually is devoted to defining what a spaceport is and who has to sign off on it.
He put it check.
It doesn't get that detailed as to, and what are the rules? It just basically says, if you want to operate a spaceport, you want to launch stuff or re-enter stuff, the FAA has to sign off on it. There's a funny little escape clause though. If you were already launching things prior to this 2018 title code change, you're grandfathered in with no evaluation. So, you know. Anyway, there's a website there that's on the Wikipedia that will give you a listing of all the FAA approved spaceports. And there's one that's in the pipeline right now in Camden, in Woodbine, I think it's Woodbine, Georgia, called Camden, that they're trying to get through the FAA.
Is where Jane born?
No, Woodbine.
No, the man called Jane. He's from Camden.
Oh, okay. Different sci-fi. Firefly, yes, different sci-fi. It's where Jane came from, is Camden. So who licenses these things? So the FAA has to sign off that it's okay for you to launch and land things, because, you know, they're things that go through the air. So you want to make sure that there's no aircraft nearby. So FAA is a good place to do that. But who actually licenses these things? Turns out lots of people are responsible for the licensing, which is one of the reasons why not even more of them are showing up. If you own land and you want to make it a commercial industrial spaceport, you can actually file for that with the FAA. Oh, but if you want to build something on it, that gets down to the local building codes and construction permits for what you want to build. And imagine you want to go into a state, I don't know, Kansas, for example, and you want to build a place that's going to launch rockets. Do you think anybody in Kansas has any clue what the construction design plans should be for a safe rocket launch facility? So they're picking some of these outlying places to pump some money in, promise some jobs, and yeah, if the FAA goes for it, we got ourselves a spaceport. So you have to look at it. There are also environmental permits that you might need from a variety of governmental institutions, because depending upon what fuel you use in your launch vehicle, they can produce nasty stuff, chemistry, burning chemistry.
Hydrazine.
Yeah. Well, hydrazine is bad. They don't typically use it for launches, but they use it for navigational propulsion. And yeah, if hydrazine goes boom, that's bad fallout. Also, you can have, oh, it went up, but it didn't go up too high, so we had to detonate it because it was gonna, you know, fly into a city or something. So the explosive manna from heaven. But let's say you wanted to communicate with your launch vehicle and your satellite once it got up there. Oh, now you got to go through the FCC and the International Telecommunications Union, because you want to have a satellite ground station and you want to send powerful radio waves. So you've got to get approval for that. Even if the place for the satellite ground station is not in your spaceport, you've still got to go to the FCC and the ITU to get your satellite antenna approved. And then if you don't want to go through all of that, maybe you can just lease an existing mothballed, defunct launch site from the US Department of Defense or NASA. So if you think back to when we stopped the shuttle program, we had a launch site. Maybe it wasn't up to current, you know, needs of technology, but you've got a lot of the stuff there that you don't have to spend money on. So it was cheaper just to lease it. So you could lease from NASA. You could lease from the US Space Force. If you're doing military launches for them, it makes sense. If you want to launch spy satellites, you have to go through the US National Reconnaissance Office. This is what the CIA and the NSA use for launching their spy satellites, as you get your NRO approval. And SpaceX has NASA, Space Force, and NRO launch approvals. So if you were to like look into one of these FAA spaceport licenses, what kind of stuff would you see? What's the basic template for describing one of these launch sites? Well, it would tell you when it was originally requested, when it was approved, and then any updates or revisions and when those were approved. It would tell you what kind of launches do you do? Do you do vertical like rocket? Do you do horizontal like aircraft taking off from an airfield? Or do you do balloon launches? So it categorizes the seriousness of your spaceport. And then the reusability of your launch vehicles. Do they come back down or do they go up and burn up? If they go up and burn up, then obviously you don't need a landing site. And what kinds of launch altitudes will you be sending? Suborbital, orbital? Where are you launching them, in what direction and with what degrees? This is usually to define the FAA cordoned off areas where you want to make sure that when your rocket is going up through there, that there's no small planes flying around. So they need to know what azimuth and inclination or elevation are you launching? If you think about it for a moment, you typically launch over large bodies of water. The Cape launches over the Atlantic Ocean. SpaceX in Texas launches over the Gulf of Mexico. If you're in California and you're launching from the Air Force bases out there, you launch over the Pacific Ocean. Of course, there's big cities in the meantime. Hopefully you're up high enough to get away from those. And then maybe what you're going to be doing aside from that, are you going to be doing payload processing? Do you have clean rooms? This is more a matter of, if you've got a clean room and the government needs one, it's kind of like if you have a car and they need a car, they flash their badge and go, police business, and they take your car. Well, if all of a sudden we need a payload processing facility for some thing that NASA or the government needs and they don't have one, they could, flash their government ID and say, we'd like to borrow your payload processing facility or your clean room. That hasn't happened, but that's part of the definition of this, is they can borrow. What kind of fuel? If you think of an airport, if you look at the FAA description of the airports, and what kind of fuel can you provide? Is it normal aviation fuel? Is it jet fuel? What kind of fuel do you have? Well, there's a classification of rocket fuel called hypergol. This is, if you take these two things and you cool them down, you chill them to the point where they're liquid, you just need to mix them and they go boom all by themselves. You don't need to sort of light a match or have a burner. You just mix the fuels. Those are called hypergols. And the common ones that you would see are hydrogen, methane, kerosene, and oxygen. But I'm accustomed to breaking them down into fuel and oxidizer. The oxidizer is typically oxygen, although you can have fuels that actually have the oxidizer built into them. Hydrazine is one of those. And then do you do refurbishments? Do do boosters come back land and you've got a building you need where you refurbish them? Do you catch fairings and then reuse them? The stuff that SpaceX does? Okay, everybody knows in business it's location, location, location. Same thing is true with spaceports. If you're going to launch something, you can go with the flow. If you're going to launch something, you can go with the flow as in the rotation of the Earth. So if you launch it the same direction that the Earth is rotating and you launch it towards the equator as a latitude, you can actually get the oomph from the rotation of the Earth to assist in your launch. That's why you have launch sites, spaceports that are I don't know, like Titusville, Florida. It was a large chunk of land that you could isolate for government secured launches. And it's 28 degrees north latitude. Well, it turns out Boca Chica, Texas, where SpaceX launches from, is 3 degrees further south than that. So it gets a little more oomph. If you want to go into polar orbit, you can go to Kodiak, Alaska, which is at 57 degrees north latitude, because they really don't want to go much higher than that. It's cold and uncomfortable, and it's hard to get roads. And so Kodiak is kind of the most northern place they can go that is still moderately easily accessible and not all that cold. You know, it has seasons. It's helpful if the site has already got the approvals for military cordoning zones, FAA zones, so that you don't have to file a lot of paperwork with every launch. You can just go, I want to use, you know, Area 39 or whatever, and they'll just file the paperwork. And you want to have a large reserve area, be it desert land or a large body of water, the Gulf or the Atlantic or the Pacific, in case something goes awry. You don't want to be dropping anything on population centers. And since you are building big things, launching big things and recovering and refurbishing them, you need to get materials and components to your spaceport. This is referred to as modalities. Do you have runways? Can, you know, cargo planes land? Do you have highways, roads? Do you have freight lines, you know, rail travel, trains? Do you have a seaport? Sometimes you have to sort of go around to deliver things. You can't go across, so you need a seaport. The Cape is considered a quad modality location, as it's got all these things because it grew up with the space program. And so they put separate runways, roadways, railways, and seaports adjacent to the Cape. Can you get the supplies and the servicing you need? Fuel. You need, you know, liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen. You might need liquid methane. Where are you going to get all this stuff from? Maybe you make it on site. If you are outsourcing things, you need somebody to assemble things for you. You need somebody to refurbish things for you. So you may need service providing vendors. You could go with a shareable facility adjacent. So you may be doing the building, but the launching is done on, you know, Kennedy Space Center. And there's a clever thing that SpaceX did with Kennedy to actually do this. Is there existing infrastructure? You don't want to go out in the middle of nowhere and go, okay, now we've got to build in the power grid. We've got to build in the internet. We've got to build in the radio ground stations. Oh, we're going to need water, sewer, and storm drainage for all this. Go someplace where all those infrastructure trunks are already there. Are you going to go someplace where there are educated people that have experience in this? The labor pool. So if you want to create a new corporation that does space stuff, where can you get the smart people from? Is there a friendly local business community that they kind of make their living off of the benefits of having a space industry there? Hotels, restaurants, housing, schools. You know, if you've got a lot of employees, you need public school systems where the children from the people that you're hiring can go to school. So all of those things contribute to making a better spaceport. And if you are going to grow, you need land, you need to expand, you need not expensive land. You don't want to be boxed in by cities. If you can think back to the early days of Disneyland out in California, they built Disneyland to a certain size and there was nothing anywhere around them. As soon as Disneyland went in, everybody bought the land up around Disneyland and built around them. They have no room to grow whatsoever. In Florida, they came in and bought enormous tracts of land and they have plenty of room to expand at Disney World. But Disneyland, it's kind of bound in. So if you're building a spaceport, you don't want to build yourself a spaceport and already be out of land. Okay, do you want to lease or do you want to buy? Think about this for a moment. Businesses are very apt to lease what they're eventually going to maybe not need, or what they can write off because they're making lots of revenue. And they only build when it makes sense that they're going to be in this long term and they don't want to have to pay monthly payments for it. And some places actually have one arm buy the land, another arm build on it, and then a third branch that actually is the leasing agency between the two. You'll find that restaurant chains, drugstore chains, they actually have this bifurcated ownership where you may find that a Walgreens will have the Walgreens land division buy the land, the Walgreens building division will build the Walgreens, and then the Walgreens leasing division will actually lease it back to the company. So you've got all these different sub corporations you can play with. They haven't really done that much in the space program, although you will find some unusually named companies that SpaceX owns that does a lot of these sub business for them that you might think are separate companies, but they're all owned by SpaceX. If you're just a company that produces products and services, you may actually find that it makes sense to lease space at multiple spaceports. Let's say you're the company that makes tools for refurbishing things. It doesn't matter whether you're refurbishing Blue Origin or you're refurbishing SpaceX. So you might want to actually lease space at 2 different spaceports to refurbish either one of them. Then there are some industrialists that are creating spaceports for which they don't have any anchor customers. They build near spaceports and say, everybody come lease some land from us and build your spaceport related companies and businesses. There's a place in Florida near the Cape that's doing that. So if you're a company that is growing, but not growing fast enough, and you don't have a huge revenue stream, the question is, if you're leasing, that's going to be a significant cash drain on your rocket company when you have nothing that is orbitally launching. So for example, Blue Origin has a suborbital rocket called the New Glenn. They have yet to orbit anything. They have another rocket called the New Shepard. Sorry, I've got them backwards. They have a New Shepard that's suborbital, and they have the New Glenn that they have yet to launch. That will be the orbital one that they can make a lot more money off of launching satellites and stuff. So in the meantime, they're leasing space, which is a cash drain. So you have to, balance it out. And then these speculative developers. So if your local county or state already has a government spaceport, you might want to establish a commercial spaceport nearby. Think of it like the international airport that's in your area. Is it owned by a city? Is it owned by a county? Is it private? This is the same thing they're doing with spaceports. They're trying to establish spaceports just as if they were airports or seaports. They're established by local governing agencies. Then again, if you're a billionaire and you want to create your own rocket launch production facility, you might buy land in the right place, build your own facilities, make sure they're adjacent to government operation centers, and then you can actually sell your services back to the government agencies. So there's a symbiotic relationship between SpaceX and Kennedy Space Center in Canaveral. SpaceX actually leases launch facilities from the US government, and in return, the US government pays SpaceX to launch things for them. So it's, symbiotic. Okay, you knew eventually I'd have a roll-up list here. The links are actually included in the links that I'll put out on the YouTube site, but this is the US commercial spaceports currently approved by the FAA. And there are a lot of unusual places. Oklahoma space industry at Burns Flat, Oklahoma. They just found that there was an industrial air park nearby. And if you're going to be launching things that go up like an airplane, drop off, go like a rocket, come back and land like an airplane, you don't need all that rockety stuff as part of your spaceport. So Burns Flat is essentially a takeoff and landing site for things that are rockets. And you can see the SpaceX Boca Chica in Texas, and you can see the Blue Origin, West Texas. Then there's some shared spaces like the Midland Spaceport that I think both Blue Origin and SpaceX lease some space there. You can see Wallops Island, and it'll tell you things. This is directly out of the FAA licensing, and it tells you what kinds of stuff are being launched, how many launch pads they have, what are the sizes of the runways, how wide are they, how long are they, and what the compass rose direction of them are. What kind of angles, how high can you point directly overhead, or do you launch at an angle? And then if you happen to have any airspace corridors that you can use. So here's two very different US commercial spaceports. The one on the left is called Mars. It's the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport. It kind of looks like it. The large water tower is for heat and sound deadening when the launch takes place. That's why they need not just a large amount of water, but also elevated to a high level to create lots of gravitational pressure to douse the rocket launch pad during takeoff. But you don't see an airfield. But what you do see is it's right near the Atlantic Ocean, so they can launch out over the ocean. On the right, we have Burns Flat, Oklahoma. Lots of room there at the bottom for industrial industry, lots of open space for that. And then you have a nice wide and long runway and an enormous tarmac for staging large aircraft. So this is kind of the variety of spaceports that the US has. And I already mentioned the distinctive characteristics of spaceports, like what are they launching? What kind of fueling do they do? Are they launching, landing, recovering? Who are the operators? Are they private corporations? Are they sharing the space? Is it a local airport authority or county? And if it was approved prior to 2018, have they been grandfathered in? And in the future, they may start out with one kind of spaceport and find that they can make more money growing it into another kind, and then they'll go back to the FAA and file one of those revisions. Here's the newest one up for bids in Georgia, in Woodbine, Georgia. This is the Camden Spaceport. And on the left, you see a lot of pretty artistic pictures of things yet to come. And then over on the right, you see all this stuff that's green. Yeah, that's existing swampland in Georgia, and it's off of Satilia River, which if they put a seaport in up here, then they can actually dock ships and refurbish them and launch them. Here is their landing pad, which is right next to an airfield. And here's one of their launch sites. Here's another launch site. This was a site where they used to test launch military missiles that were designed to shoot down other rockets. And so they're repurposing that for private commercial use. This one has not yet been approved by the FAA, but they're working on it. And then there's the sharing. I mentioned operational or mothballed government sites. Here's the ones that you might recognize as popular. At Kennedy Space Center, there is Space Launch Complex 39A, which is where they used to launch space shuttles. That's been refurbished by SpaceX, and in the future is expected to be shared use by Blue Origin and United Launch Alliance. At Canaveral, the military one, Space Launch Complex 40 is used by SpaceX for military launches. So SpaceX is actually launching from 2 different pads at Titusville area. SpaceX also has another military launch satellite launch complex for polar orbiting called Space Launch Complex 4E at Vandenberg. So once you lease one of these sites, it's up to you, the tenant, to make any modifications you want. And it's beholding to you, the tenant, to restore it back to its original shape. I guess in the case of something that was mothballed, I think Space Launch Complex 40 might have been an old Apollo launch site that was all rusty. So the first thing they had to do is raise it to the ground before they could build it up for SpaceX. So I guess when SpaceX gets done with it, if they want to return it back to the US government, they'll have to reduce it. So it turns out Blue Origin and United Launch Alliance are kind of late to the game on this sharing of sites. And so they came back and they wanted to enter suit against NASA and the Kennedy Space Center, saying, you let SpaceX lease to space and they've converted it to launching only their stuff. And they went back and they looked at the fine print in the contract with SpaceX. There's nothing in the contract that says exclusive. There's nothing in the contract that says it's shared. So its sharedness is undefined. And apparently the US court system said, I don't see a problem here. If SpaceX is willing to share, then Blue Origin and ULA can share the sites, but it's up to them to build them out for their own use. Blue Origin didn't like that, because if you think about the Space Launch Complex, there's liquid methane, liquid hydrogen, and liquid oxygen. Both the creation facilities and the storage facilities, they'd like to share those things. And SpaceX is going like, no, those are ours. You can share the pad, but those are our industrial facilities. You'd have to pay us to use them. So Blue Origin and ULA are like, we don't like this. But it was kind of arrogant on their part to say, we'd like to share the stuff that SpaceX spent their billions on to build. Must be nice. And here's a picture of Kennedy Space Center Launch Complex 39. This is Space Launch Complex 40 at Canaveral. Everybody always has to ask, what are the 4 large, tall tower things? Those are for lightning strikes during launch. They not only drain away the static, they also are taller than the rocket. So if you do get a lightning strike, hopefully it will hit those. And you can see the little gantry there, the little tower in the center. That's as high as a Falcon 9 would be. So you can see that these lightning arresters are twice as high as the rocket. There's also Launch Complex 39A that they use for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. This one I found while I was looking. So spaceports are these things that you have to go through a lot of cost and red tape to get approvals from various agencies. That's because they're on US soil. What if they weren't on US soil? What if your barge that you land the rockets on was ocean going? And what if it was 12 miles offshore? Would you still need all that red tape and costs? Turns out, no. There's a loophole. If you think about casinos on board cruise ships, once they get past that old 12-mile limit, they can open up the casino, and all the local ordinances regarding casinos do not apply. And then when they come back in, as soon as they approach the 12-mile limit, they shut down the casino. The same thing could be said of launching rockets. Once you get beyond the 12-mile limit, that's no longer US soil. You can launch from, I don't know, how about floating offshore oil platforms that are refurbished to become launch sites? And that's apparently what SpaceX has done. SpaceX has purchased 2 retired deepwater floating offshore oil platforms from a company called Valaris. They paid $3.5 million apiece for them, and they're being refurbished at 2 seaports in Texas. They're going to be called Phobos and Deimos, after the moons of Mars. And they're expected to be ready for launch and landing in 2022. There are currently booster landings and Dragon capsule landings that are done offshore. They also do SpaceX booster landings onshore, but they could just as easily do them offshore. If you can launch, land, and refurbish on one of these oil platforms, you now have a fully sustained operation that operates outside of US jurisdiction. It'll be interesting to see how the courts take to that. But the funny tie-in that I saw there was, if you know the history of Elon Musk and SpaceX coming from the money he made off of PayPal, which was a company originally a company called X.com. One of the early people that came into X.com and made billions off of it is a guy named Peter Thiel. Peter wanted to go off and form his own floating independent nation. And it turns out he can do that. It was not the governance issue, because there have been occurrences in history where things outside of national water boundaries have actually operated briefly as their own independent nations. So there are already rules in international diplomacy for recognizing floating things as nations. So Peter Thiel wanted to build his own floating island nation. Here is SpaceX's Deimos offshore platform being refurbished. Now, how did I know it was Deimos? Well, that's a picture of what looks like an oil rig being refurbished. And if you zoom up closely, you'll actually see that the name of it is Deimos. So that's one of them. There's another one that looks just like it at a different seaport that is being refurbished. Apparently, the crane they used for the oil pipeline work is going to be refitted to be used as the launch gantry and crane. So shared technology. Apparently these oil platforms have living quarters for up to about 50 people. So that's all your launch and recovery workers. And if you have robots that can do the work like they do at Tesla car manufacturing plants, that may be all you need. But how would you make this a floating nation? Like this. So this was the final before going defunct proposal that Peter Thiel had for his Pacific Ocean floating island nation. He was trying to get an existing Pacific Island nation that's recognized by the UN to buy into it. And they found out that this was a giant, money pit. So they backed out of it. So it fell through. But they estimated that the initial cost for island development of this size would be $225 million. And that it would cost about $8 million annually to operate it. Well, if you're already out there spending $3.5 million for the guts of a derelict oil rig that you're going to probably spend many times that to make into a launch and recovery complex, $225 million sounds cheap to build a floating country. So if the FAA and the FCC and places like that give Elon Musk too much hassle, he may just go, let's sink $3 to $5 billion and build our own floating island nation, and then we can do whatever we want. So it'll be
Didn't you
interesting to
say-
see how that goes.
Sorry, can I ask a question here?
Sure.
Okay, so you just, I'm trying to follow in a sense of that, and I may got this wrong in
That's
mind.
okay.
Okay, so NATO turned it down, it went defunct, but because they found that it was gonna be a money pit?
No. NATO didn't turn it down. A Pacific Island nation that is recognized by the UN
Oh, UN.
was being enticed to invest money in it, so that this nation would actually be a part of this Pacific Island nation that's already recognized. It was kind of like a buy-in plan.
Okay,
And
wait,
that
wait.
nation found out that they would have to put too much money into it to make it
Oh.
happen. And they said,
Okay,
we've
so
already
it
got an
wasn't-
island.
So it wasn't the United Nation that was turning it down, it was the nation that they were asking
To buy
invest
into it,
in
yeah,
this.
yeah.
They were saying to this country that already exists,
Yes.
hey, we have this great idea to have this island nation.
Mhm.
How about you help funding it?
Yes. Now, why would a Pacific Island nation already recognized by the UN want to move all their people to a floating island?
And so he wanted them to move all their people that were
Yes.
from the island to
To
this
a floating
island
island nation. Yes.
and just rename this island as the island that wasn't floating?
Yes.
Oh, well, that sounds tricky. He couldn't do that, could he?
Yes, he could.
They would let him do that?
Yes, he could.
And-
They already
right.
had it arranged. The problem is, how do you entice a Pacific Island nation to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into a floating island concept?
Which he didn't, right?
No, global warming. There are a
Yeah.
lot of Pacific Island
Global-
nations that are going below the surface. Their
Yeah.
inland fresh water is already threatened. All they need is another 6 inches of sea level rise, and they won't have a nation anymore.
That's right.
So this is a picture of an enticement to a nation. This was a real island idea that we're
Yes.
looking
Yes.
and he really
And
wanted,
when was that? Like more than 20 years ago, right?
No. This was like 4 years ago
Oh, okay.
that it went defunct. He had a couple of variations. He first wanted to do it completely independently, go it alone, go rogue. And he found out, I don't want to spend all my money on this. So then he said, well, these would be really good for all you Pacific nations that are about to be submerged. So he wanted to be the builder of it and make money off those island nations. And they all said, yeah, we've got a problem at the moment, but they're basically going to be leapfrogging. They're going to go from being their own independent nation to their entire nation being refugees, leaving their island and going to the next higher island nation.
That's what they've decided to do?
Yes, it's so much cheaper to do it that way.
The problem is there is no fresh water. It doesn't matter if you have a floating island or not. If there is no fresh water, you have no choice.
Yes. So the lowest level islands are the ones that are going to be affected first. And they're already making arrangements with other island nations to basically take their entire population and classify them as UN refugees and have them move onto another island nation that's agreeable for them to be received.
Wow.
This is reality. This is happening probably in the next 20 years. You're going to
I
see.
wonder if you could build an island nation instead of it being offshore, being in a lake.
No, I've actually looked at that. If it's in a lake, a body of water that's encapsulated by another nation, it can't be.
Yeah. Wow.
But I think island nations are a interesting concept, and I think there's a lot of islands in the Pacific that are going to have to consider this, or find a way to just become refugees, and every 20 years become refugees again.
Yeah, Guam is in the news lately.
Yes, But Guam is in the news for taking refugees from
Yeah.
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That's a loophole. They're going to be on US soil because Guam is a US possession.
Yeah.
So they will not be considered as refugees. They will be considered as voluntary immigrants.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Given that what they've done for us, I would think that would be fine. They've already passed enormous levels of military background checks in order to do what they did for us.
And we're talking about the people from Guam, or we're talking about the people from,
People
No,
going to
the
Guam.
people that helped us in Afghanistan, that
oh, okay.
went through all the
Okay.
military background checks.
Okay.
Those are the people that we'd like to see arriving in Guam, because
Yeah.
they would make very nice US citizens, because they've already gone through a lot of the effort to do that. But first, they have to be brought in so that certain people don't freak out. And if you bring them straight into the US mainland, there are certain people that will just freak out. But if you bring them into Guam, they're on US soil, but they're not on mainland US. So less freak out. But there are already people saying, how much do we know about these people? These people could be criminals. I don't think that's the case, because they already went through extensive military background checks.
So those are the only people they're accepting.
Yes.
Interesting.
And remember, when they did that for us, it was not only them, but their families that also got background checked. So I think they're reasonably safe to be brought into Guam. Guam seems very willing to bring them in, because Guam, being a small island nation, as people age out, if their population doesn't grow, they could have a stagnant society. So they're very happy to have, well-trained, knowledgeable people coming into their island nation. If they don't make it to the US mainland, I think Guam would be more than willing to accept them as US
Yeah.
citizens living
Yeah,
in Guam.
they've done it before.
Yeah.
You never know when you're going to need a Farsi translator.
Things could heat up again in Afghanistan, and we may need Farsi translators. Yes. And these are ready-made folks.
Yeah. It would be nice if it didn't happen, though. Hard to believe.
Yes. Yes. Well,
Hard to believe that it will all go smoothly, but this is
the
good.
US has a historical pattern of, if we ever bring our military somewhere, we kind of stay. We don't go. We create an entrenchment. We affect their society. We affect their financial systems, and we just stay. And we either grow it to a certain level beyond its original size and just stay, or we shrink it down to a still noteworthy size and just stay. So us breaking that pattern in Afghanistan hopefully will be a trend in the future. We're going to come over somewhere, we're going to help you, and then we're going to leave because we don't need to be there anymore. So
Right. We did what we said we were going to come for.
yes.
And that's what we did there. We did what we said we were going to go and do.
Yes, we weren't going to nation build, much like we tried to do in Iraq. Nations have to build themselves.
Yeah.
No, they're not going to. There's
Yes.
too many tribes and
Yes.
all kinds of problems there.
Maybe in another 10,000 years, they'll finally, get the message and build themselves a nice, peaceful, prosperous nation.
Well,
But not at the moment.
wasn't his speech about you guys aren't gonna be a one nation, but you could divide into a couple different ones and talk about it?
We've also got a bad history of doing that.
Oh.
There was this place called Persia that is now called Iran and Iraq.
Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
search for partition, and you can see how bad it is.
So it didn't work.
All those things that are happening now are all related to the end of the First World War.
Yeah.
And the partition.
or sometimes we can go in and partition just because we want the benefit, like Panama. The US
Yep.
partitioned a previous nation and said, this is now going to be called Panama. We're going to build a canal here.
But we released it. We didn't own it.
No, we're the
No,
best
no,
way to
what
describe, the
Monroe
best
is
way to describe
referring
it
to
is,
is Panama didn't used to be a country. It used to be part of a country called Colombia.
yes,
And the
Mhm.
United States parked warships off that part of Colombia and urged them to allow Panama to become an independent nation, from which we then leased the Panama Canal.
so it was for our investment benefit, large industrial revenue, that Panama exists at all.
It worked out for Panama.
Mm,
I think there was a guy in the middle that you're ignoring called Noriega.
But yeah,
He was on our side, then he was not on our side,
right,
then he
right,
had to get out.
right.
Yeah.
I remember Noriega. I was in the service when that happened.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was awful. But it's still, now it's gone back to the Panama people, right?
Panamanian people. Yep,
Panamanian people, thank you.
Yep.
And so, and they're happy about that. I don't know about
yes,
Colombia.
Yeah.
May not like the situation.
yes, but we went back in with a heavy hand and said, the canal's not big enough. You need to make the canal bigger for us. So the nation of Panama spent billions of dollars on widening the Panama Canal.
Oh, they get their fees.
Yes. Over the next 50 to 100 years, they might break even.
Oh,
but not the people, the politicians and the people
Yes.
who own the banks.
Yes, the people that run the banks in Panama will make their money.
So that's a bad thing. Well,
Yeah.
you can't get anything good here. Wait a minute.
I'm about to. So here's
Oh,
a good thing.
good.
Here's a good
Okay,
thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if you had to pick a spaceport where it basically ticks all the boxes, what would be the best spaceport, most beneficial, the one that will be the financial success? It's what SpaceX is doing at Kennedy and Cape Canaveral. They have their own land for their own work, but they lease launch and landing platforms from the government. Customers are already there because SpaceX does business with NASA, the military, and satellite ride sharing. They have quad modality transportation. They've got road, rail, sea, and air. They already have all the necessary approvals, FAA, NASA, and Department of Defense, Air and Space Force. They have large areas of open tract land that they can lease if they need it. They have the Atlantic Ocean that if something goes awry, they can drop it in the ocean. They have a large local community that really supports them with education, experience, and the motivation to make sure it's successful. They have the local infrastructure. So all the build out for large amounts of power, FP&L's there for that, internet access, satellite ground stations, and all of the water, sewer, and stormwater to keep the ground dry, even though it's a swamp. They have all the local community, the hotels, the restaurants, the housing, the schools. So it's there. The next place that ticks off all the boxes would be SpaceX at Boca Chica, Texas. You can tell that they pretty much run free when they can close the road. But closing the road is not something that the local residents like, because if you close it on the weekend, it means that the local residents can't get to the beach, and they like going to the beach on the weekend. So they get a lot of flack for closing the roads when the road closure includes the weekend. But that's, you can't launch whenever you want to. You've got to launch when things are lined up just right. Plus, the environmentalists are starting to say, is this really a good thing to have SpaceX at Boca Chica? Because, rocket fuels make pollution, things blowing up, causes debris to fall. And it's a private, not a military facility. So, if it was a military facility, the local community and the environmentalists should just go, we'll sue the federal government. The federal government will basically say, so we don't care. But since it's a private industry site, they can be sued. So as I was mentioning earlier, maybe offshore floating platforms are how SpaceX gets around all this stuff. So keep an eye out for that. So in conclusion, commercial US spaceports are definitely a big business thing. Collectively, there's billions being invested in these things. Some are speculative, and it may take years for them to get the proper tenants to make them successful. Given the level of investment and what they're doing and where they're doing it at, do not expect for them to all be successful in the long run. Should a private rocket company fold, let's say a Blue Origin or a SpaceX or a Rocket Lab does something and they can't financially sustain themselves anymore, if that happens to be the anchor for a spaceport, they'll go away, but it'll also decimate the local community. If you remember what happened at Kennedy Space Center when Apollo shut down, and then when the shuttle program shut down, it had a major impact on the finances of the local community. So if these spaceports go bust after they've already built up a local community, you could see decimated local communities. And also remember, if you have a spaceport that there's lots of companies sharing that, if you have the anchor tenant, the big guy, go out, it may not produce enough revenue stream in the remaining tenants to keep the shopping mall going, so to speak. So whenever you see, a big shopping mall and they lose their Sears, JCPenney's, they lose their anchor stores, the shopping mall remodels itself to support smaller sized tenants. They dice up things. And when that doesn't work, they sell off sections of the shopping mall to erect a public storage building because that's the only way they can make money out of it. So you may see that a spaceport closes down, which takes the local community with it, and it just becomes a ghost town. Then again, you might see a spaceport become unprofitable because these are new companies. These are new concerns. They may not financially and fiscally know how to operate a spaceport where it's profitable in the long term. And if they're a large private corporation, it could suck down their cash reserves. So they may sell out, much like shopping malls that were losing money just because they were poorly run, but they were in a good location. If they would just refurbish them, they refurbished the shopping malls and now they're making money again. That could happen with these spaceports. A spaceport that was just mismanaged or didn't have the right tenants could be acquired by a larger spaceport. And, now you have spaceport consolidation. And I could see either a SpaceX or a Blue Origin as eventually being a spaceport consolidator. So if a lot of local businesses look profitable but can't sustain themselves in the industrial real estate area outside Kennedy Space Center, it may be that SpaceX goes, yeah, we need a company to do that for us. Rather than outsourcing to this company that's losing it, we'll just buy them up for a song and make them a part of SpaceX, and now they can be successful. So that would allow a certain amount of the employees to stay on. Whereas if they just completely shut down, you now have the old post-Apollo issue of you've got highly trained workforce that has no work anymore. So that could happen. And like I said, put a push pin in the floating spaceports, because if they can save millions of dollars and reduce red tape and the time to do all of that just by being offshore and make their own nation out of it, that's something I think you have to watch, because they may actually find that, yep, it's profitable to do that. So, hey, UN, I want to form my own floating nation.
Well, would this be negative to the United States if somebody?
Yes.
Yeah.
Taxes. Yes,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be making the taxes. We wouldn't be leasing out launch complexes from NASA and the military.
Yeah.
And they, being a floating nation, they could sell their launch and recovery services to any nation on the planet.
So is there something the United States is doing to encourage people to stay here?
No, they're doing just the opposite.
Oh,
They're, but with the FAA and the FCC, they are irritating the hell out of SpaceX, which, if anything is going to drive them to go offshore, it would be things like, okay, we got FAA approval for our launch. How come the FAA and the Coast Guard can't keep small planes out of the launch area? There was a SpaceX launch in the last 30 days that had to cancel their launch 30 seconds before launch because some guy in a private plane wanted to go flying around the launch pad to watch the launch up close. And he flew in the cordoned off zone, and the FAA called SpaceX and said, you've got to put your launch on hold. Apparently, this prop job private airplane was several miles away from the launch site, but still within the zone such that they postponed the launch, which cost SpaceX, I'm sure, several $1 million to say, okay, drain all the fuel back out of the rocket. We'll launch it tomorrow.
Whoa.
So
but did this guy get fined, or was he legally allowed to be there? Did they just say, oh, okay, you want to go up close? I can't believe that.
Yeah,
Okay.
they have their range safety, range security.
yes, the FAA and the Coast Guard manage range safety and security. So if they're not watching and a small plane is heading towards the cordoned off area, they should have been on the radio and warned them off.
Oh, okay. So you're saying they
They
didn't do
didn't.
that.
They let them fly into the zone anyway.
Monroe, do you know if Elon Musk is still a South African citizen, or he became an American citizen?
I think he has dual citizenship.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, sometimes I think about that, a lot of people are complicating his life without necessity because they don't like his guts.
They don't like him as a human being. They don't like the success of SpaceX. And they don't like the fact that because he actually goes through all the appropriate paperwork to get the approvals and he endures all of that, he gets inroads that the other startups don't get because they don't want to learn the paperwork. They don't want to do the paperwork. They don't want the oversight. They just want all the benefits. So you'll see companies like OneWeb, for example, does not license its launches in the US. They found a nation out in the Pacific that was willing to look the other way. So all of their radio permits are not US, even though they have money invested from the US. So people might think that SpaceX is getting off easy. No, if you ever want to look and see how much paperwork they do, you can go to the FCC sites, you can go to the FAA sites and say, is SpaceX supposed to be allowed to be in Boca Chica? Yes, you can go read the tons of paperwork they had to file and get updated all the time to do this. Well, this is how I found out there's actually a Starlink satellite station 5 minutes from my house because they had to file with the FCC and the FAA for that. So they're filing the paperwork. It's the companies like Blue Origin and OneWeb that are finding any way they can to not have to do all the stuff that SpaceX did because they're late to the game and
Piggyback.
they want to be in the big time, and they can't get to the big time because they're not doing all the necessary stuff.
Well, it costs a lot too, I guess, for these other groups and this billionaire guy.
I think Jeff Bezos has the billions to invest. Elon Musk certainly has the billions to invest.
So
So
these little people don't, right?
Yeah. So, but the other thing that I find interesting is that Elon Musk started with Tesla. Tesla is not, it was, his dream and what he
Yes.
wanted to make money with it. and SpaceX was the toy. Now he makes more money with the toy than with the, the actual project.
Yes, but there are people that don't like him for his success with Tesla as well. You might have read in the news something called a death cross.
Oh, I think I saw it.
Tesla's stock versus market value is going through what is known as a death cross. If you're a startup company and you're burning cash faster than your revenues coming in, and then you go public, the total valuation of your company could be less than your operational costs. And you've gone through this like death cross that startup companies rarely survive long after they've gone through the death cross. The difference here is that Tesla's share price has been so high for so long that it's caught up. So the share price is coming down. It's still in the like, $600 per share range. So it's still like amazingly high, but they're
It's more
starting
like a
to grow.
correction.
They're starting to grow out things. So they're spending money. They're building plants in Germany and in Texas, and that requires a lot of cash flow investment. So you're starting to see the share price and the cash flow going through this death cross. But all they've got to do is say, okay, we're going to let some more shares of Tesla out, and we'll get another few billion. So it's not the normal death cross. They're trying to hype it as if it's going to be the end of Tesla. I don't think so.
It sounds more like a correction.
Well, the stock price is certainly a correction. Even though Tesla's been very successful, a stock price of $700+ a share does not make sense. A share price of maybe $400 to $500 a share, that's reasonable for the success that they've had. So SpaceX acquired the solar panel production and installation company, and there are now people saying, you just bought out your brother's business. No, because if you look at the roofs of places like Tesla manufacturing plants, they have tons of solar cells on top of them. And those solar panels came from the SpaceX sub company. So it's the left hand of Elon Musk washing the right hand of Elon Musk. But in order to make that maximally profitable, he acquired what was a separate company. But, people don't like his business acumen. Probably because he's successful.
Plus the cousins gigafactory.
Yeah. I saw where Germany is wanting to fine Tesla for building their German gigafactory too fast. They basically went through every permitting process that was put before them. And after the plant was in the process of being built, they brought new permits in that didn't exist previously, that now they're being fined for not having followed them. So it's interesting. How can Germany make, millions of dollars of revenue off of Tesla that probably they don't deserve, but Tesla will try and fight it in court, and if they lose, they'll just, stroke a check. I think it was really, the likes of Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen that, hey, German government, make it hard on them. Of course, that's just my opinion. It could be true.
Yes, because now they see the writing on the wall that everybody wants to go electric.
Yes, I think it's very telling that Honda has discontinued 2 of their luxury car lines. They're saying that there just aren't enough people wanting to buy luxury cars. How can you say that when Tesla is selling cars at over $100,000 a pop, and you're Acura was, maybe $70,000. So they're willing to spend $30,000+ more in order to have a Tesla Model S Plaid than your Honda. So you're discontinuing your Honda because nobody wanted to buy them. Why don't you start building high performance electric vehicles that people do want to buy for more money? And then maybe you can still build them. But since they didn't, this is the collapse of the internal combustion automobile industry, that the first ones to go will be the luxury cars. This was actually predicted. There was a guy that's got a YouTube video out where he said, here are the 10 things that are going to go away because Tesla is successful. And one of them was the luxury car market for internal combustion engines. It was not by accident that the very first Tesla that Elon Musk decided to build was the very expensive, high performance Roadster, 2-seater car. Because wealthy people want those kinds of things. And then the next thing he built was a high-end luxury sedan, 4-door sedan, the Model S. And then in order to make the margin even more, we'll build something that, hey, look, Mercedes has these gull-wing doors. We'll build gull-wing doors too, except ours will be wider and they'll gull-wing upwards, not outwards. So you can actually use them to park in narrower parking spaces. So, but I think eventually he'll be building an electric vehicle that gets about 200 miles on a charge that will be about the $20,000 range. Just cause.